we've talked a lot about this Bloodline story and seeing how things play out from here. As we know, we've got sort of the new Rogue Bloodline imposing their will right now on SmackDown. You've got still the people that are waiting to make their return, like Roman Reigns and Jimmy Uso. And then you've got the pair on Raw. And that is, of course, two former Bloodline members in Jey Uso and Sami Zayn. And there's been an interesting thread over the past couple weeks on Raw. And that is that both Jey and Sami have made some interesting comments regarding their past history with the Bloodline. And as I always say, I feel like the more you study the way Triple H does things, and the more you understand that they do everything for a reason. And I think when you start to see them dropping in those little past breadcrumbs about the history of the guys and how it made them what they are today, right? Jey Uso is now this big single star because he proved that he could leave the Bloodline behind and go on his own and now possibly have a chance to win the Money in the Bank and become a world champion. Sami Zayn knew that at that point, back in January of 2023, he had no choice but to hit Roman Reigns in the back with a chair because that was the breaking point. It had to change from there. And what has he done since then? He's the guy who went on to beat Gunther, to stop that unbelievable streak as Intercontinental Champion. He's gotten back to sort of his roots, right? And he knew that it was time, again, for him to leave the Bloodline, to go on his own, to do what he needed to do, or felt like that was right. And so Sami actually had a promo on this week's edition of Raw that more so focused on Alpha Academy. When you actually read and listen to the words that Sami said, the entire thing regarding his stance on the Alpha Academy after his entire feud with Chad Gable, things become a little bit more intriguing because you do now see Sami leaning more into that history with the Bloodline. And it's not even just that, right? It's not like he's mentioning it in every segment or doing it like this, but he's bringing it up. And you guys know it's the same thing I mentioned with the Kevin Owens promo he did a couple weeks ago, talking about how he respected the original Bloodline of Roman Reigns, Jimmy, and Jey Uso. Why would Kevin Owens ever think about all the things they did to him, right? But he made it clear that he did respect that pair. He doesn't respect this new Bloodline, but he respected that group. That's what he told Paul Heyman. Here's what Sami Zayn said on this week's Raw. And we can either read into this as a tease, or we can just throw it away and say, this is absolutely nothing. But here's what Sami said as he was addressing the situation before you had Sheamus and Braun Breaker come out to set things up for what is clearly going to be, I think, an eventual, match, not just involving those three, probably Ludwig Kaiser as well, and for the Intercontinental Championship. Maybe we get that as soon as Money in the Bank. But here's what Sami said about the Alpha Academy. I'd be lying if I said it would be easy to move on from the Alpha Academy. I feel for those guys. I understand those guys. I've been those guys. But if there's one thing my time in the Bloodline really made me learn is that everybody has to do things on their own time. I didn't leave until I was ready. Jey Uso didn't leave until he was ready. But I'm convinced that when they're ready, they'll leave Chad Gable too. So look, there's not a lot there, right? But the most important part of that is that he does mention the history with the Bloodline. And he does mention that there was that connection with Jey Uso that is still there, and WWE has kind of left these two apart for a little while because I think you want to make it very, kind of a magnitude of a moment whenever they do finally get back together. And that is the question, right? Is this going to lead to Sami Zayn now coming back together and being an honorary Uso again, somehow, some way in this story as we continue to build and build and build towards, like I said, the eventual returns of Roman Reigns and Jimmy Uso, not even to mention the likelihood that The Rock is going to be involved with this at some point way further down the line, maybe closer to WrestleMania season, which is actually not that far away, 6 months away if you start the Rumble and go from there. So there's a lot of things in play. And yes, we've all talked about the possibility of a War Games match and all of that. Is that where Sami comes back into this picture? Or does Sami come back into this at all? But I don't think it is a coincidence. And this is, like I said, from looking at the past ways that Triple H has done things, how he's built up storylines, not just on the main roster, but if you go all the way back to NXT, when he's running NXT, these are the kind of things that he puts into these promos to make sure that when you look back, once we get to the big moment, right? We get to the climax of the story, the big blow-off. Once we look back, we can see why it all made sense. Not every story is going to hit on that, right? There's going to be going back and say, well, that didn't really connect well. But in this instance, you've had Jey bringing up how he's gone it alone, no reason for him to ever go back to the Bloodline saga. Sami Zayn has now gotten away from that. He learned something. He just mentioned it. He made sure to bring up what he learned, and he ties it into what is actually going on right now for him character-wise, right? Dealing with the Alpha Academy, wanting to see them get away from Chad Gable, and ultimately they may have done it just by the fact that Uncle Howdy and the Wyatt Six just completely obliterated Chad Gable. So we'll see how Gable responds to that. But I do think, like I said, there is a reason for everything that they do. And the fact that Sami just brings this up to kind of tie this lesson into the Alpha Academy. Otherwise, he could have said anything, right? He didn't have to say the Bloodline. He didn't have to bring up his past history there. And I think that's what you want to do if you're trying to tell that longer-term story, which, like I said, it feels like a little ways away from this. Maybe the next huge moment comes at SummerSlam. There's a lot of questions. But you could also say, well, it's Sami's connection with Jey, and how does maybe that lead Sami back to the Bloodline? Here's how it could lead back to the Bloodline. We know Jey Uso is in the Money in the Bank match, right? And we also know that you could be watching this and already know the outcome, but we know Tama Tonga has a chance as well to qualify for that match. So getting those two somehow into that match, maybe there's a scenario where Jey does win the Money in the Bank briefcase. Think about what that does in terms of adding the stakes and the potential cash-in opportunities. There's a lot in play here. And we already know, too, that the Bloodline has kind of set their sights on Kevin Owens, Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes involved now. And so this is where I think if you're looking at Sami's situation, and does he make his way back into the story? Whenever they do this big multi-man tag or whatever the big blow-off is, you've got to think that somehow it involves Jey Uso being sort of in a perilous position to where either he needs help, he needs backup, and maybe, other than Jimmy or Roman, if that's the way they decide to go, maybe it is the honorary Uso, who has always kind of had just that very unique relationship with Jey Uso. And maybe that is how you bring Sami back into this thing to go up against Solo Sikoa, Tama Tonga, Tonga Loa. We know that Hikuleo is going to be there now as Tama Tonga, it seems. That's the suggestion based on the trademark they made. And we know, of course, as we've been talking about for months, that Jacob Fatu is still back out there as well. And however they decide to introduce him into this thing, and maybe that's where people have suggested maybe you put him on the side of Roman, and Sami is not involved in this any way, shape, or form. But I think there's going to be that opportunity. And you know why? Because I think Sami Zayn's going to lose that Intercontinental Championship probably pretty soon, because it seems to me that there's a very good chance that they're setting up Sami Zayn versus Braun Breaker. And I think if you do that, you probably want Breaker to break Sami Zayn, because I think that would really put Breaker over to a new level. And we've already seen the way they're doing things there. So if you connect all the dots and you see how they're building everything up, the possibility of Jey Uso being Mr. Money in the Bank, the possibility that Sami loses that Intercontinental Championship and moves on to a different story, it's all there to have the Bloodline set their sights on these two again. And not just one version of the Bloodline, both versions. It could be the new Bloodline sets their sights on Jey because he has that briefcase, all those other things, right? And maybe that's where you get the interaction with Jey and Tama Tonga, finally sort of getting those two crossing paths and how that brings the story back, right? And that's where, like I said, if Jey finds himself in a position where he needs help, Sami could be there for the rescue. Jimmy could be there for the rescue. Roman could be there for the rescue. Now, here is another question you've got to ask yourself. If they're going to bring Sami back into the story, how do you do it knowing how the story ended last time, right? How do Roman and Sami come back together? And even if it's just a one-night thing, and maybe that's really the intrigue and the suspense of the story, is how do all of these parties trust each other again? And maybe that's the story WWE is going to tell, knowing that this new version of the Bloodline, they're all united in their basically, thirst for blood. Like, that's what they do. They go out and just annihilate people. Maybe not to the extent of the Wyatt Six, but they go out and just, they're hounds, right? They go out and really just try to tear guys apart. That's how they tried to build up, Tama Tonga, Solo, kind of in this new character and all that. And so how do you, though, build it up to where you've got to get all of these parties who have won in one way or another, Roman, Jey, Jimmy, and Sami, they've all sort of been on the other side of the other one, right? Like, there have been situations where there has been that turmoil. There has been the turn, like we said, with Sami and Roman Reigns, hitting him with a chair in one of the most memorable angles of all time at the Royal Rumble. So those are all questions that have to be answered. I have no idea how they get there. And like I said, I have no idea if Sami is ultimately involved in this Bloodline story. But I think the fact that they're mentioning it in promos, they're going that far to at least bring it up. And yes, character backstory always builds, kind of what they decide to do in the future. But you could completely just ignore it and not bring it up, or you can use it the way that Sami just used it on Raw in kind of the story that he's trying to tell and the lesson he's trying to tell with the Alpha Academy. So I think there's a reason for it. That's the way Triple H does things. It's just like all the stuff where you get the stuff going on in the back. People are standing in the background. It's all there for a reason. And I think that Sami bringing up the Bloodline, Jey Uso brought up the Bloodline a couple weeks ago. We've all got to somehow get back together. The band comes back together. How do they do it? Is Sami involved? And how does it play into all the different match combinations they have? And ultimately, the big one, as we said, could be Roman Reigns versus The Rock at some point in the future. But will Sami Zayn be involved? You guys let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, be sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Always enjoy your feedback, your thoughts on these stories. That's what we love to do here. We really like to break down these different stories, look at the possibilities ahead, because it's a lot of fun right now. Again, and I like the way Triple H does things to keep you thinking on this kind of stuff and to really see if, hey, did we mention that for that reason, or is it just kind of a red herring to lead you in another direction? So we'll find out, but you guys let me know what you think about Sami Zayn potentially coming back to the Bloodline.